All right, so this is going to be part two of your lecture in the endocrine system, starting with Roman numeral 3 in the outline. So I just want to clarify one thing when I was talking about the somatostatin here. I just want to go back. So the somatostatin that's secreted in the pancreas, the somatostatin is also secreted in the pituitary gland. However, they have different actions on the body. So somatostatin has a lot of different effects on the body, and I just want to make sure that it's not just inhibiting growth hormone, that it also can inhibit in the gastrointestinal tract. It can also inhibit the pancreas, the hormones itself made in the pancreas, so insulin and glucagon. It can also inhibit the exocrine glands here, producing their digestive enzymes. So it inhibits both of those gastrointestinal functions. So there's lots of little functions of somatostatin, but I just want to make sure that everybody knows that it can inhibit growth hormone, but also it has these effects on the gastrointestinal tract. All right, so moving on to part 2. We can control hormone levels in the blood, and we do it with, there's lots of different ways that the hormone in the blood is sort of mediated. So one is basically just the rate of secretion of the hormone itself, what controls the hormone to be secreted, also how is the hormone transported around the body, and how is it broken down. Okay, so this is just a cartoon of the thyroid gland, and if you have an overactive thyroid, right, you could have hyperthyroidism. So this is just a little cartoon about that. All right. So the control of hormone secretion, this is neural control of secretion. So there's humoral secretion. Now, where's the humoral? We'll start with that one. So the humoral control is coming from the blood. So humor refers to the bloodstream. Right? The blood was one of the humors of the body, one of the liquids of the body. So we can see that blood glucose levels is included in this example. And also the regulation of blood potassium levels, so the ion concentrations are also part of humoral signals. So whatever is found in the blood can control the rate of hormone secretion. So if we just look at the blood glucose first, right, we have, let's just start here at the low blood glucose. So if we have low blood glucose, it's going to, well, actually, let's start here at beta cells. So beta cells will increase the insulin secretion when you have high blood glucose. So you just ate, it's going to cause the beta cells to secrete their insulin, so insulin level goes up. Then the cells throughout the body are going to increase their glucose uptake, which is going to decrease the blood sugar. And then that's going to feed back on your beta cells. So when the blood sugar drops, then this shouldn't be there, right? The beta cells are not going to be producing more insulin, all right? So this is a feedback mechanism of what is in the bloodstream. And we can do the same thing with an ion like calcium. And we can see that if you have high calcium concentration in the bloodstream, that the adrenal cortex can be prompted to produce more aldosterone. And the aldosterone is going to act on the kidneys to increase the amount of potassium that's going to excrete. So you're going to see more potassium in the urine, and that way you're going to lower the blood concentration of potassium ions, and that lower concentration will feed back to the adrenal cortex, right? And so the adrenal cortex will stop producing the aldosterone. So how much hormone is in the bloodstream is detected by the adrenal cortex, negatively fed back, right, and or the beta cells of the pancreas. So that's what is happening. So the hormones can be secreted based on what they can detect in the bloodstream. So that can be either hormones such as your axis, your hypothalamus, anterior pituitary, your stimulating hormones or your tropic hormones. So if those are in the bloodstream, it's going to stimulate hormone production. Or you can, for example, this blood glucose level, right, we can detect molecules directly. Or we can detect ions or any other metabolite, okay? And then back to neural signals. So the hormones that are controlled by neural control is going to be this example here. So we'll take a look at this stress coming into the hypothalamus. So your brain is picking up that you're stressed, right? So your brain is taking all this incoming information, these afferent signals, you're stressed, and the hypothalamus ultimately will respond. And by picking up the production of corticotropin releasing hormone, right, that's going to prompt the anterior pituitary to secrete its adrenocorticotropic hormone. That's going to travel in the blood to the adrenal cortex to make its cortisol secretion. So increased levels of cortisol is going to be responded, because the stimulus was the stress that you're feeling, right? The pressure to perform well on an exam, or the pressure that you have if there's an awkward personal situation or social situation that's very stressful, or if you're in a stressful relationship. All these things are kinds of stressors that will ultimately impact what the hypothalamus does in terms of secreting, releasing hormones. All right, so let's talk about the transport of hormones through the bloodstream. And just a quick word on how hormones are taken up by cells. So the two big categories of hormones are peptide hormones or steroid hormones. So a lot of hormones are little protein chains, peptides, or they are steroid. Steroid hormones are your sex hormones, right, like testosterone and estrogen. And then peptide hormones, like growth hormone, for example, is a peptide hormone. So if proteins are not able, because they're too big, to cross through the plasma membrane, that just doesn't happen. So they're going to have a membrane-bound receptor, and so the binding of the hormone is going to happen outside, external to the cell. That's going to cause a signal transduction pathway until you get some kind of cellular response inside the cell. Even though the hormone is sort of detected on the outside of the cell, the hormone can be brought in through endocytosis, and it can be destroyed. So peptide hormones can be eventually brought into the cell to be destroyed, or they can actually be destroyed in the bloodstream. So these peptide hormones, there are peptidases, there's hormones in the blood that can actually break those down too. So when you release hormones to the bloodstream, they don't last forever. They're actually quite kind of short-lived, and they do disappear because they are metabolized. And when we say metabolized, we mean that they're destroyed. Steroid hormones are different because these are hydrophilic substances. They are small enough that they can actually travel right through the plasma membrane, enter into the cytoplasm, and the receptor for the hormone is actually inside the cells, an intracellular receptor. And so now we have a hormone receptor complex, and then that is going to elicit some kind of cellular response inside the cell. So now the hormone's inside the cell, right, it can be broken down or metabolized inside the cell. The trouble with steroid hormones, because they are hydrophobic, right, they're not going to want to dissolve in the blood plasma. So when hydrophobic hormones are secreted into the bloodstream, they are usually bound, or they can be bound to these carrier proteins, right, to make them more soluble in the blood. So for an example, I have the sex hormone binding globulin. So globulin, remember, is just a shape, a certain like round shape of a protein. And this can increase the half-life of hormones in the blood and decrease their metabolism. So if they're bound to a protein, they can last longer in the bloodstream. So you can see here that the carrier protein has released the testosterone. The testosterone itself needs to enter into the cell. So that's important. The testosterone, if you look here, the testosterone, if it's bound to the carrier protein, it does not enter the cells, right? Because proteins don't enter the cells. So you have to release the sex hormone from the binding protein, and then the sex hormone can travel in and, interact with its receptor inside the cell. So this is one reason why sex hormones can be found in the blood. They kind of last longer in the bloodstream because they're not immediately taken up by their target cells, that they are found, they can be sort of last longer as they're bound to their binding proteins. Another reason why they last longer is that they can actually be stored in fats. So if you look at the, maybe I mentioned that a little bit later, but I'll mention it now. Hydrophobic hormones, because they're so hydrophobic, they can actually be stored in adipose. Okay, so adipose tissue can take up these hormones and then keep them for a while and then release them later. So like fat tissue can actually be a source of releasing the hormone over long periods of time. So your sex hormones or your steroid hormones actually have a longer life in your body because they either are bound to carrier proteins or they can hide in the fat and then they're slowly released from the fat. So this is just an example of the half-life of different kinds of hormones. And we can see that this is a thyroid hormone or protein hormones. And the half-life, thyroid hormones are sex hormones. Not sex hormones. They are steroid hormones, So they're bound to protein. You see that they are bound to a carrier protein. And compare, if you look down at the half-life, here we can see that they have pretty long half-lives, 6 days and 1 day, compared to your protein example hormones, insulin or antidiuretic hormone. Their half-lives are relatively short. So also here, right, your steroids, cortisol, testosterone, and aldosterone, these guys also have protein binding and they have a longer half-life than compared to your proteins. Okay, just a little chart. You don't need to memorize any of this. Just an example of the difference between steroid hormones that are bound to protein. They have longer half-lives than the ones that are not steroids. All right. So let's see here. So just talking before we get to abnormal secretion of hormones, just the rate of hormone metabolism, just to cover that again, is that the hormones can remain in the blood for a short amount of time before they're metabolized. So hormones are always metabolized. They have a lifespan inside the bloodstream. They become internalized by the cell. So either they become internalized by the receptor by endocytosis, or they become internalized by just diffusing through the cell membrane. So hormones they also, if you look at letter D, under the rate of hormone metabolism, they are also metabolized by the liver. So the liver is going to screen all the blood, right? Your bloodstream goes everywhere in the body through the liver, and the liver can actually start to break down your hormones as well. And then I do mention at the very end of this area that lipophilic hormones, the hormones that love fat, right? The hydrophobic hormones are going to be bound to carrier proteins that lets them last longer in the blood, or they can be stored in adipose. And forgot to mention that doping, if you are, or not you, but if you an athlete who uses testosterone, right, or steroid hormones to improve their performance, that extra testosterone or the steroid hormone they're using is actually stored in their fat. So that storage is going to last up to 2 weeks. So you can actually detect the excess amount of steroid that they're taking 2 weeks after. All right, so now let's look at the abnormal secretion of hormones. So when you talk about hormone problems, a lot of times it's too much or too little, which is what we're going to talk about here. So this is hypersecretion, too much, and hyposecretion is too little. So the hypersecretion, there's actually two kinds of categories to this, primary hypersecretion or secondary hypersecretion, but you can also say primary hyposecretion and secondary hyposecretion. What it means is it's a primary disorder. It's from the endocrine gland itself producing too much hormone. So the gland that makes the hormone is producing too much of it. So most of the time this is because there's some kind of growth or tumor. You're increasing the amount of cells in that endocrine gland and therefore producing too much hormone. The tropic hormones, right? So this example here is going to be growth hormone. Too much growth hormone is going to cause the body to grow. There's two forms of this. So there's gigantism and acromegaly. But let me back up and just say, like, the primary hypersecretion is the pituitary gland, right, making too much growth hormone. So that's the primary gland that makes the growth hormones, the pituitary gland. If it were a secondary hypersecretion, the hypothalamus would be making too much growth hormone releasing hormone. So you would have this tropic hormone that's elevated, and that's making the endocrine gland make too much hormone. So the secondary hypersecretion is actually the increase of tropic hormones. And this would have to do with either the hypothalamus or it would have to do with the anterior pituitary. Okay, so in terms of the primary hypersecretion, the tropic hormones are usually lower than normal because they get the feedback, message that there's a whole bunch of growth hormone, so don't produce any more tropic hormones. And so that's going to be a characteristic of this kind of hypersecretion where you have low amounts of tropic hormones because there's an abnormal amount of the hormone produced sort of pathologically. Okay, so now let's get to gigantism versus acromegaly. Gigantism is where you have a pituitary tumor, so you have an increase of growth hormone. And before puberty, when your epiphyseal plates are still allowing your long bones to get longer and you have an excess amount of growth hormone, people can become very, very tall. So this is the tallest person on record was 8 feet 11 inches tall. So that's very, very, very tall. They span between 7 and 9 feet. Oops, excuse me. After puberty, if you're still producing too much growth hormone, that's called acromegaly. And there's only a few bones that could respond. Let me just go back here. This is Andre the Giant. Andre the Giant also has acromegaly. You can see he's very, very tall, but he's also very, very large. And there's key features to acromegaly where the brow, so his the bone above the eyebrow, or at the area of the eyebrow, gets extra, extra thick. The mandible gets extra, extra thick. The hands, fingers, and the feet all get really large because those are the bones that can still respond to growth hormone, even though you're not going to get any taller after puberty. But also your organs are going to respond to growth hormone. So people with acromegaly will have enlarged organs. And then I do have on the outline that if you abuse growth hormone is used sometimes by athletes because it increases lean muscle mass. So it gets you that really, fit, muscular body without the adipose. But it also causes your organs to enlarge, right? Because you're post-puberty. And so a lot of people might end up dying early on from an enlarged heart or an enlarged liver. So it's very dangerous to take growth hormone. And I know that there's a trend or some kind of, there are some people out there that believe taking growth hormone later in life will help. It's like the fountain of youth, where it helps you increase your metabolism. It helps you feel younger, more youthful. But also it helps promote the growth of cancers, right? Because growth hormone prompts your cells to grow, and it can, accidentally kick off maybe a quiet cancerous lesion cell in your body or collection of cells where maybe it would have been no big deal or grew so slowly that you would die before it became a problem, but growth hormone would actually kick it off to become a problem. Anyhow, so moving on to cortisol levels. So this is an example of hypersecretion of cortisol. So this is going to be the primary one. So this is meaning that your adrenal cortex, right, is making too much cortisol. And the excess amount of cortisol is going to negatively feed back on your hypothalamus to decrease the amount of the releasing hormone here. And that's going to decrease the amount of adrenocorticotropic hormone. But there's some kind of regulation problem happening. This is not, there's not a feedback mechanism on the adrenal gland. So here there's probably some kind of problem like a growth, a tumor, something happening where you just keep putting out the cortisol and it does not respond to the negative feedback. Too much cortisol is going to result in Cushing syndrome, and you can kind of, it's pretty small, but this throughout the body there are features of Cushing syndrome. Thinner arms, but you bruise easily. You have fat pads here at the neck. You have a pendulous abdomen. You have adipose stored in the abdomen. Red flushed cheeks. There's also a moon face. It's a very round face. And then this is secondary hypersecretion, right? So this is where you have your tropic hormones being in excess. So we have an excess amount. The anterior pituitary is producing too much adrenocorticotropic hormone. This prompts the adrenal gland to also produce too much cortisol. This feeds back. It's supposed to feed back to the hypothalamus and to the anterior pituitary, but the feedback mechanism does not work because there's some kind of problem here, right, at the anterior pituitary that's just making it create a lot of ACTH, and then this is already low, right? So it's not going to have, anyhow, it's not, this is low already, but for some reason it's not having an impact on the anterior pituitary. But anyways, this is an example of secondary where you have the issue is actually within the tropic hormone. All right. Last issue with hormones is that there can be abnormal tissue responsiveness. So you'll see that you have normal levels of hormone in the blood, but it's the tissue that is not responding to the hormone. A lot of times it's the receptor that's not working. So this is a mutation. This is an inherited disorder where it's called Laron's dwarfism, and there's a mutation in the growth hormone receptor. So even though these people are producing adequate amounts of growth hormone, their cells are not responding to them and they become short, right? Or the phenotype is having a very short stature. And the other example is diabetes mellitus type 2 or type 2 diabetes. And that is where there's adequate amounts of insulin in the blood. The receptor that binds the insulin is there, it's present, but there's some defect in the signal, right? There's a defect in the signal that does not allow the GLUT4 receptor to work. So this is the problem. And so you're not getting the glucose leaving the bloodstream. There's a decreased amount of glucose intake. All right, so that's a problem on the tissue end. It's not on the hormone end. All right, and our last topic for this chapter is just how hormones interact with each other. So the first one is antagonism. We talked about this, how two hormones have opposite effects on the body. And we can see that this is looking at calcitonin and parathyroid hormones. So there is going to be a calcium level, your homeostatic calcium level, which is between 9 and 11 milligrams per 100 mils. And if you raise your blood calcium levels, let's say you drank a big glass of milk, had some cheese, that is going to feed to your thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is going to increase its calcitonin levels. The calcitonin is going to stimulate the deposition into your bones, and that's going to decrease the blood concentration of calcium because it's going into your bones, and then we're back at balance. If you fall, right, there's somehow you're low on calcium, you're going to have this lower imbalance. The thyroid gland is going to, the parathyroid gland is going to secrete the parathyroid hormone. The parathyroid hormone is going to stimulate the osteoclasts to start working to liberate the calcium into the bloodstream, restoring calcium balance. All right, so calcitonin and parathyroid hormone is your antagonistic set. Another example of this is insulin and glucagon. All right, so high blood sugar, you're going to promote insulin release from the pancreas. The insulin release is going to stimulate your cells to take up that sugar, and it's going to create low blood sugar. If you have low blood sugar, it's going to stimulate your pancreas to make glucagon. Glucagon is going to stimulate your liver to undergo glycogenolysis, right, to break down glycogen into glucose, and glucose is going to go into the bloodstream to raise your glucose levels. All right, then we have this additive effect where you have net equal, the total effect of different hormones equals the sum of the individual effects. So that might be a little bit difficult to understand, but if you look at growth hormone, testosterone, and thyroid hormone, they all have the effect on growing the body, increasing metabolism, and bulking up your muscle mass. However, if you're secreting each one of these together, they don't have an additive effect. You're not going to get even bigger. You just are going to have, they're each going to have their own separate effects. So the net equal effect on the body is just basically the sum of their individual effects. All right, they're not going to enhance each other's effect. This is different from synergism, where you can have two or more hormones. If they're released together, then the effect on the body is even greater than those two hormones alone. So an example of this is glucagon, cortisol, and epinephrine. All of these hormones are going to liberate glucose into the bloodstream, and this is called stress-induced hyperglycemia. So here we see cortisol levels alone, right? So cortisol, here's blood glucose levels. So cortisol alone raises blood glucose levels quite modestly. Glucagon by itself will raise it, then fall. Epinephrine will raise it as well. If you add glucagon and epinephrine, you can see that we have an additive synergistic effect where the graph goes way up above glucagon alone and above epinephrine alone. So they have this additive effect, or not additive, I should say. They have a compounding effect, a synergistic effect. And then if you put all three hormones together, my gosh, right, you have a skyrocketing blood glucose level that is way above any one of them individually. So that's what's meant with synergism. And then lastly, we have permissiveness, where one hormone is needed in adequate amounts for another to exert its effects. So one hormone is required in order for another hormone to work. And so the examples here are thyroid hormones are required to express the receptor for bronchial smooth muscle cells. So remember that beta adrenergic receptors are for adrenaline and norepinephrine, or epinephrine and norepinephrine. So in order for epinephrine and norepinephrine to work on these smooth muscle cells, you have to have thyroid hormone. Estrogen causes the expression of progesterone receptors. So again, we need estrogen to promote these receptors so that progesterone can work in the uterus. All right, and then a couple questions just to wrap up. Insulin-dependent diabetes mellitus is a disease caused by insufficient secretion of insulin from the beta cells of the pancreas. What is this type of secretion called? All right, so hopefully out of the choices you have, this is hypo, right? It's insufficient secretion, so it's low levels. Which of the following is not one of the common signals that alter hormone secretion from endocrine glands? So remember, what signals your endocrine glands to make hormone? Yes, yes, and yes. So the answer is B. That is not one of the signals. All right, and that's the end.